On November 7th, 1936, the morning on the farmstead of Verkhniy Klyuch was unusually mild, deceptively quiet, and filled with the scent of rotting autumn grass. After the early October frosts, which had managed to coat the riverside reeds with a thin crust of ice, this sudden warmth seemed like a true blessing to the exhausted peasants. Dear friends, if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments where you watch us from. This is very important to us. Enjoy watching. The thermometer nailed to the wooden doorframe of the village council building had risen to 8 degrees Celsius by 9 o'clock in the morning, a virtually unheard-of occurrence in the remote taiga at this time of year. The cattle, locked in their stuffy barns, mooed anxiously, demanding freedom, and Nikifor Savelyev, the collective farm chairman, decided to drive the herd to a nearby meadow to conserve the dwindling hay reserves. The village children, tired of their heavy woolen clothes, poured out into the street with joyful cries, clad in light linen shirts and worn jackets, completely forgetting their fathers' warm hats. The women flung open the heavy shutters of their log huts, shook out dusty woolen blankets onto the wattle fences, and let the fresh, spring-scented air ventilate the rooms, stale from autumn. The entire village seemed to breathe a deep, relieved sigh, believing that the harsh Siberian winter had shown mercy this time and retreated indefinitely. No one in Verkhniy Klyuch noticed the barely noticeable, deathly pale, bluish streak slowly appearing at the very edge of the northwestern horizon, just above the tops of the centuries-old black spruce trees. No one, that is, except 50-year-old Marfa Kovaleva, whose estate stood isolated at the very entrance to a remote taiga ravine where the winds blew even on the hottest July days. She stood by the old blackened log frame of an abandoned well, which locals avoided and affectionately called a dry grave, for its alarming depth and lack of clean water. Marfa wasn't looking at the melting snowdrifts beneath her feet, or at her smiling neighbours cheerfully discussing their evening plans. Instead, she was peering intently into the distant haze of the faded sky. The blue line on the horizon was filling with a heavy, leaden sheen with each passing minute, rising higher and higher, transforming from a harmless haze into a monumental, ominous wall. This wasn't a thundercloud or the harbinger of an ordinary autumn rain. It was a colossal Arctic front rolling in, blocking out the daylight and bringing with it the deadly breath of an icy desert. Marfa had seen such a thing only once before, when she was a 12-year-old girl in a remote village on the Angara River, where a hurricane struck within 15 minutes, freezing 30 loggers to death right in the logging area. The elders in her native land called this phenomenon a black blizzard, or the breath of the dead, against which ordinary human structures turned out to be flimsy cardboard toys. Marfa turned slowly, picked up a heavy bucket filled with the remains of last year's oats, and resolutely walked toward the door of her squat house, built of tarred larch. Her 16-year-old son, Stepan, who was chopping thin birch branches for kindling on the porch, looked at his mother in surprise, noticing the sudden change in her pale expression. Marfa had never given in to panic. Her hard life as a widow had taught her to face any adversity with a stony, almost frightening calm. But now her grey eyes were filled with stern determination. "Stjopka, drop the axe, call the girls, and immediately drag from the barn all the sacks of grain we've stashed for the spring sowing," she said, quietly but clearly, in a voice that brooked no argument. The son didn't ask any unnecessary questions, as in the 4 years since his father's death, he had grown accustomed to trusting his mother's instincts, which had saved their small family from starvation more than once. While the neighbours continued to enjoy the unexpected warmth, feverish, arduous, and, to an outside observer, completely incomprehensible work began on the Kovaleva estate. What made this taciturn widow so insightful and prepared for a catastrophe that caught the rest of the village, including the seasoned tiger hunters, by surprise? Marfa arrived in Verkhniy Klyuch as a widowed stranger 3 years ago, having bought for next to nothing an abandoned house right by the forest, which the local men considered cursed and uninhabitable. She grew up in the harsh northern climate, where people valued every pound of dry firewood and every handful of wheat, and perceived the cold as a living, merciless creature. The local settlers, who had come from the southern provinces, built their huts hastily, making the walls thin and the cellars shallow, fervently believing that nature would always be kind to them. Martha immediately noticed an old well on her property. The previous owner had dug it 15 meters deep, but never reached the aquifer, hitting solid rock. This deep, dry well became the subject of constant ridicule from the villagers, who joked that the widow was digging a tunnel to the very centre of the earth. But Marfa saw this abandoned shaft not as a useless pit, but as a unique underground storage facility, capable of protecting valuable resources from the vagaries of the Siberian climate. Throughout the second half of August and September, Marfa and Stepan secretly constructed the bottom of this 15-meter deep well, using an ancient Swedish food preservation technique. They lowered dozens of thick planks of bog larch, constructing a sturdy wooden platform at the very bottom, raised 30 centimeters above the stone foundation. Marfa carefully coated the walls of the lower part of the shaft with a thick layer of a mixture of river clay, sifted charcoal, and dried pine needles, which perfectly absorbed excess moisture. Stepan constructed an ingenious ventilation system from the hollow trunk of a young linden tree, which emerged at an angle and was protected from precipitation by a heavy birch bark canopy. Air passing through this long underground channel was cooled to a constant temperature, but remained absolutely dry, preventing the development of mold or rot. By the beginning of October, the underground bunker was completely ready, and Martha began to implement her main plan, which finally confirmed the status of her madness in the eyes of her neighbors. She began methodically, sack by sack, lowering all the summer's worth of grain from their small plot, which they had managed to obtain and trade for furs with visiting merchants, to the bottom of the well. In total, exactly 500 kilograms of select, carefully sun-dried wheat and barley, the entire value of their small farm, was sent underground. Chairman Savelyev, riding past her house in a cart, stopped at the fence and watched, with obvious bewilderment, as the widow lowered the heavy canvas sack into the dark abyss using a makeshift winch. "Martha, have you completely lost your mind about your widowhood? Why are you burying bread in a tomb? It'll rot there by January from the damp," he shouted loudly, shaking his head. The village women, returning from rinsing their laundry, picked up this taunt, and soon rumours began to circulate throughout Verkhniy Klyuch that Kovaleva had gone mad and was hiding grain from non-existent robbers. Marfa ignored the taunts, continuing to carefully stack sacks at the bottom of the well, knowing that words could not warm a person when the ground froze 2 meters deep. She sealed the well hatch with a massive oak lid and covered it with a thick layer of dry straw and earth, turning the storage facility into a completely unnoticeable feature of the yard. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the deceptive calm that had lulled Verkhniy Klyuch broke with a deafening, cannon-like crack from the centuries-old larches in the taiga. A powerful Arctic front, moving from the Arctic Circle, slammed full speed into the band of abnormally warm air hanging over the village. The temperature, which had hovered around 8 degrees Celsius that morning, plummeted to -25 in just 20 minutes, instantly coating the thawed ground with a glassy, icy crust. A hurricane-force wind, gusting from the northwest at over 30 meters per second, tore the thatched roofs from the flimsy huts, and drove fine, stinging snow pellets horizontally, obscuring all visibility. People who rushed outside in light clothing were unable to breathe. The icy air literally seared their lungs, turning every movement into a desperate struggle for survival. The collective farm herd, driven out to a distant meadow by the chairman, scattered in panic, and the cries of the shepherds were instantly drowned out by the furious roar of the awakening blizzard. Marfa Kovaleva managed to nail the heavy oak shutters on her windows and lock the massive front door with 3 wrought iron bolts just minutes before the first wave of the black storm slammed into the wall of her estate. Inside, the thick logs and the blazing stove made it relatively quiet, but the house itself shook from the terrible blows of the wind, as if it were being pounded with heavy logs. Stepan and his younger sisters sat by the stove mouth, listening in terror to the wild howl emanating from the chimney, where the wind whipped up icy whirlwinds. Marfa calmly approached the icons, lit a small lamp, and turned to the children, whose faces had turned pale with a subconscious fear of the awakening elements. "Don't be afraid. Our walls are strong. There's enough firewood in the hallway to last a month, and our grain lies where no storm in the world can reach it," the widow said in a calm, hypnotic voice, sitting down at her spinning wheel. She knew that the true trials of Verkhniy Klyuch were only just beginning, and this night would forever divide the village's life into a before and an after. By the next morning, the storm hadn't abated, but rather gained its full, crushing force, dropping the thermometer to a terrifying -45 degrees Celsius. The hurricane-force winds, which never let up, made the cold feel like 60 degrees Celsius, turning any attempt to go outdoors into a death sentence. In the flimsy frame houses of the settlers, built without regard for Siberian conditions, window panes began to shatter, and the icy wind instantly chilled the living rooms, coating the walls with a thick layer of frost. Panicked, people burned furniture, dismantled interior partitions and fences, trying to keep the fires burning in their freezing stoves, which were unable to cope with the colossal heat loss. But the worst disaster was that ordinary village cellars, dug to a depth of only 2 meters, began to rapidly freeze due to the lack of deep snow cover, which the wind had completely blown off the fields. The potatoes, beets and grain leftovers were turned into ice stones, which when thawed turned into a slimy, inedible mush. On the 10th day of the ice blockade, when Verkhniy Klyuch was completely cut off from the outside world by enormous 3-meter-deep snowdrifts, there was a hesitant knock on the door of Marfa's house. Standing on the threshold was the chairman, Nikifor Savelyev, whose face was covered in grey patches from mild frostbite, and whose once expensive sheepskin coat looked scorched from constant exposure to the stove. Behind him stood several exhausted, shivering village men, the same ones who, just a month earlier, had laughed louder than anyone at the widow and her abandoned well. "Marfa, we're in trouble. The collective farm barn is buried up to the roof, and all the grain in the small cellars has frozen and rotted. The children have nothing to eat," the chairman said hoarsely, not daring to look at the woman. The men shifted from foot to foot, hiding their hands in their sleeves, expecting the widow to recall all their past taunts and point them to the door. The false pride and arrogance of the well-fed days completely evaporated in the face of starvation, which was already knocking on the windows of every second village hut. Marfa listened silently to the chairman, set aside the cast-iron pot of hot porridge, and slowly rose from her bench, wrapping a warm woolen scarf around her head. She uttered no reproaches, nor did she smile maliciously, for true Siberian wisdom excluded petty vindictiveness when it came to saving lives. "Stepan, take a shovel, a winch, and clear the way to the old well. It's time to open our dry grave," the widow calmly ordered, taking heavy canvas sacks from a chest. The men rushed to help the young man, feverishly pushing aside the packed, rock-hard snow in the yard until the oak lid, securely covered with straw, was revealed. When the heavy hatch was lifted, a wonderful, dry and warm air wafted from the depths of the 15-meter shaft, distinctly scented with the tart aroma of fresh pine needles and ripe wheat. The underground chamber, created despite the general mocking madness, had fulfilled its purpose perfectly, preserving the precious cargo completely intact. Stepan descended to the bottom of the well using a rope ladder and tied the first sack to the rope, which the men unanimously pulled to the surface under the watchful eye of the chairman, frozen in amazement. Nikifor Savelyev reached his numb hand into the canvas sack and pulled out a handful of large, golden grain, completely dry, cool, and without the slightest trace of dampness or mould. 500 kilograms of choice wheat and barley, which the neighbours had thought irrevocably buried in the earthen tomb, stood before them as tangible proof of human foresight. The men looked at this grain with a mixture of awe and shame, realizing that this widow, whom they considered insane, had just saved their children from certain death. Martha stood on the porch, leaning against the wooden railing, and for the first time all winter, a barely noticeable, wise smile appeared on her pale face, the smile of someone who knew how to see through the false warmth of the short autumn days. The entire second half of January and the entire harsh February of 1937 turned into one endless, drawn-out day for the residents of Verkhniy Klyuch, where the line between life and death was measured by a handful of dry wheat. Marfa Kovaleva personally oversaw the distribution of grain from her underground bunker, preventing the chairman from taking all the supplies to the collective farm warehouse, which was still swept by icy winds. Every morning, a chain of shivering women with wooden tubs and canvas bags stretched to her estate, each receiving just enough wheat to make a thick soup for the children for the day. Stepan and the men built a huge hand mill in the main hall of Marfa's house from 2 flat granite millstones, and the sound of falling grain never died down in the hut until midnight. The widow's wisdom saved not only people. Some of the barley was used to support the life of the last collective farm horses, without which spring ploughing would have been simply impossible. The brutal Siberian frosts began to gradually subside only in the first week of April, when the heavy spring sun finally managed to pierce the thick curtain of grey taiga clouds. When the enormous 3-meter deep snowdrifts settled and turned into raging muddy streams, the residents of Verkhniy Klyuch were able to fully appreciate the scale of the catastrophe they had endured. The area looked as if a merciless enemy army had swept through it. 32 frame houses of the displaced residents stood roofless, with blackened windows and chimneys cracked from the temperature fluctuations. Yet not a single person perished in Verkhniy Klyuch during that terrible winter of -45 degrees, and even the weakest village children greeted spring with rosy cheeks. At the general meeting of the collective farm, which the chairman, Nikifor Savelyev, called right on the square near the half-destroyed village council building, an unusual, solemn, and deep silence reigned. The chairman, his face still dark with the scars of February's frostbite, slowly walked to the centre of the circle, removed his worn fur hat, and bowed deeply to Marfa, who stood in the crowd. 4 months ago, I stood by this fence, laughing with the whole village and calling this well the dry grave of a mad woman, Savelyev said, his voice hoarse and breaking with emotion. He paused, choosing his words, and his stern peasant face twitched with the belated realization of the abyss into which they had nearly fallen through their own stupidity. My sons are alive today only because this woman was smarter than all of us combined and didn't listen to our foolish ridicule, continuing to bury her grain underground. I was a presumptuous fool, Miss Kovaleva, and this entire collective farm owes you our lives, which we now pledge to live with intelligence and respect for your wisdom, the chairman concluded, to the dull, agreeable hum of the village men. The summer months of 1937 transformed Verkhniy Klyuch beyond recognition, forever erasing from the people's minds the habit of building flimsy dwellings and hoping for mild weather. Under the guidance of Stepan, who faithfully followed his mother's instructions, 11 families dug deep 15-meter shafts on their plots, converting them into ventilated underground storage facilities. The walls of these new cellars were coated with a mixture of clay and charcoal, and the floors were lined with river stones to completely eliminate dampness during the damp autumn months. The phrase "building like Marfinos" quickly spread throughout the neighbouring taiga villages and Angara farmsteads, becoming synonymous with absolute, uncompromising preparedness for any natural disaster. People understood the main truth that the widow carried throughout her harsh life. True security lies not in waiting for good times, but in the ability to prepare for the worst manifestations of the elements. Marfa Kovaleva lived in her squat larch house until 1961, entering a ripe old age surrounded by her 7 grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who were raised on her taiga stories. The old abandoned well, which saved 71 souls during that terrible winter, stood in the estate's courtyard for exactly 40 years, until its wooden gate finally rotted away. Today, a modest granite stone stands at the site of this unique underground well, brought from a distant mountain quarry by the grandchildren of the rescued children. Carved into this stone are 3 short words, which in Siberian dialect signify the highest degree of human fortitude and foresight. These words are simply, "The wall holds the heat." And every traveller passing by Verkhniy Klyuch stops at this spot to recall the story of the widow who looked deep beneath her feet.